Hello everyone, Mark here, Mark's Max Muscle. And in this video, we're going to look at some bodybuilders with, in my opinion, some of the worst genetics in the history of bodybuilding. But we're not going to see a lot of guys like this. We're actually going to take a look at some great bodybuilders. So there's a little bit of a positive twist to this somewhat negative video. We're going to take a look at some bodybuilders that actually overcame having, I guess, like I said, some of the worst genetics. But what does that mean, really? I mean, there was Franco Columbu. He was actually one of the strongest bodybuilders back in the 60s, 70s, things of that nature. But obviously, all the other guys were head and shoulders above him as far as genetics are concerned. Smaller waistlines, much taller, big man's chest, and just sculpted abs. Those were things that Franco Columbu just did not possess. I mean, put him in a lineup. You got Frank Zane there at the end with God-given lines, shape, aesthetics. Arnold Schwarzenegger, look at the clavicle width. I mean, the guy was a beast. And then you got Sergio Oliva, maybe the best genetic specimen of all time. Serge Nubret also, incredible genetics, clavicle width, tiny little wee waistline, and God-given abs. So it's obvious Franco Columbu fell last in line as far as genetics are concerned. It wasn't just his stature, V-taper, it was his arms too. I mean, he had very long arms and very short biceps, making it difficult to pack on a lot of muscle in the arm development. And that's another thing that has to be taken into consideration when selecting so-called bad genetics. I mean, everybody on this list somewhat could be considered a genetic freak, of course. I mean, Franco Columbu, he was probably one of the strongest guys out there. And that was one reason why he did overcome having the worst genetics of most of the guys back then. He developed maybe the best back out of anybody out of the 70s. And like I said, all of that has to be taken into consideration too. So Franco Columbu had the genetic ability, the nice lower lat insertions, things of that nature. So he definitely was not last in line as far as genetics are concerned. But it's obvious, guys, when you sit him next to Arnold Schwarzenegger. And for those of you who are thinking maybe Arnold should be on this list, think again. Arnold had that ability to pack on so much muscle on those arms. This was way before they had growth hormones, stuff like that. And even Arnold, known for having a somewhat of a wide waistline, has a tiny waistline in comparison with Franco Columbu. Here's Hubert Metz. And much like Franco Columbu, I'm actually a huge fan of this guy, and he was actually a great bodybuilder. But great genetics he did not have. Hubert Metz had the longest legs that I have ever seen, and maybe the shortest torso. He had incredibly long arms as well, making it very difficult to pack on a nice tricep sweep. But I mean, he did what he could, and he actually developed quite a set of arms, quite a set of guns indeed. And it wasn't just the long legs, wasn't just the long arms. He didn't have much of a V-taper either. I mean, sit him next to, who's this, Josip Wilkosh, who actually did not have much of a V-taper either. Has a much better lines than Hubert. And Hubert, he had a very, like I said, a very difficult time packing on mass on those arms, the lack of tricep meat, and you can even really see those long legs here. But having said that, longevity also has to be taken into consideration when selecting somebody with bad genetics. Hubert Metz competed at the 1994 Masters Olympia competition, so at the end of the day, did he really have bad genetics? More of a structural thing, if you ask me. And since we were on the topic of longevity, you'll notice in the center that is Chris Dickerson. And I am sure many of you guys are going to mention Chris Dickerson for having bad genetics. The thing of it is, guys, he was in his 50s here in 1994. That's right, in 1983, when he won the Mr. Olympia, or 1982 rather, when he won the Mr. Olympia title, he was 43 years old. So most of the pictures, things of that nature we see of Chris Dickerson, he was past 40 years old. He actually had some pretty decent genetics. And for his time, I guess he looked pretty darn good. Big, thick calves, somewhat of a small waistline, good back, good chest. So yeah, Chris Dickerson, definitely not on my radar for a guy with bad genetics, and competing into his 50s, I think, proved that. Here's your top 6 at the 1994 Mr. Olympia event, and it is plain to see that Porter Cottrell sticks out like a sore thumb as far as bad genetics are concerned. I mean, it was 1994, and by this point, yes, everybody that competed in bodybuilding had great genetics. They wouldn't even have entered the sport if they didn't. But it's obvious, guys. You had Paul Dillette, who was a freak. Chris Cormier, he was unbelievable. And it's obvious Kevin Levrone, Dorian Yates, and even Sean Ray wasn't that tall, but the guy had dreamlike lines, structure, things of that nature. Porter Cottrell, he wasn't the tallest. He had a pretty wide waistline. Didn't have the best abs either. But would you believe that he actually defeated Chris Cormier at that 1994 Mr. Olympia event? So he somewhat overcame these, what I would say, at this point in time in bodybuilding, bad genetics. So Porter Cottrell, one of the great ones. I mean, he placed top 5 at the Mr. Olympia event with what I like to call, at that point in time in bodybuilding, we'll say subpar genetics. Here is Paco Bautista, and it is plain to see, this is 2002, guys, and it is plain to see that as far as muscle and the wheels are concerned, the guy was a genetic freak. But his structure compared to his contemporaries, guys that he was placing a little bit ahead of, actually, they had far superior genetics, structural traits, and poor Paco, he would put on so much muscle, but it seemed like his waistline, it was just too much. And it wasn't due to what he was taking. I'm sure everybody else was taking the same type of, cocktails, things of that nature. It was just strictly genetics. But those were the type of genetics that gave him the ability to pack on the muscle on the wheels and the arms, things of that nature. Also a little bit of a Fig Newton, little gyno, and I think that could be traced back to genetics as well. Obviously, the things they're taking inflames it, but not everybody gets it. That's a nice little genetic treat. That's what the Fig Newton is. It's nature's revenge, the Fig Newton bar. So at this point, guys, 2009, you had Branch Warren, who I'm sure some of you guys are going to mention for having bad genetics. But you're not going to get into the sport of bodybuilding at this point unless you had great genetics. So everybody under the sun was a genetic freak. But speaking about Branch Warren, on the contrary, in my opinion, he had some of the best genetics. Look at him when he was younger. Unbelievable lines, great set of abs, small waistline actually, and nothing says good genetics like good calves. Nothing says living like my chocolatey chip cookies. But yeah, you can't grow those calves without superior genetics. Ditto with those impressive legs. Actually had some decent lat insertions too. So Branch Warren, in my opinion, not on the list. The thing of it is, he probably trained too hard. I don't want to say he took too much stuff. I don't want to disrespect my man, the Texas Beast. I just think he trained too bloody hard. And that's not an insult. That's just, didn't know when to say when. He placed second at the Olympia though, so can't knock that. And at this point in bodybuilding, you can't really knock anybody's genetics, because even the guys at the bottom end are absolutely genetic freaks. I mean, take Johnny O. Jackson, for instance. Some people would say that the lack of ability to pack on a lot of meat on the wheels is a genetic disability, but in actualities, baby please, Johnny O. Jackson had some of the best upper body genetics in bodybuilding history, back included. There is this guy, Lucas Osladell. Some people would be nitpicky and say, oh, his sternum, he has a pointy sternum, he has bad genetics. He's a genetic freak. Come on, look at those glutes. He has some of the freakiest glutes I've ever seen. And you can put anybody in a lineup nowadays, guys. And you could pick the worst genetics against the best genetics. William Bonac, for instance, some people might say he has a wide waistline. To put on that much mass on the back and the wheels, you have to be a genetic freak. And I guess the last word on this is genetics are becoming less important because they are more important to get into the sport. So my point is, there is less of a distance between the best genetics and the worst genetics on the Olympia stage. And that's all I'm going to say about it, guys. Not saying Hadi Choopan has bad genetics by any means, but he has proven that genetics are becoming less important by defeating all these guys that are absolutely superior to him in that sense. Hit thumbs up on the video, guys. Some great bodybuilders here that overcame their bad genetics. Tominator actually inspired this one. He did a video much like this one, so go over to Tominator's channel and watch his video on it. Subscribe to the channel. Have a great one.